You ever get that feeling that you're just watching the same story on every single channel? Like the whole national conversation is just stuck on repeat? Well, today we're going to trace the history of American media to figure out how our reality gets shaped, bought, and sold. Let's dig in and see how we ended up here.
It all really starts with this one number, 6. That's it. Right now, just 6 massive corporations control over 90% of all the media that Americans consume. We're talking everything from your local news channel to the biggest Hollywood movies. It's all coming from this tiny, tiny pipeline.
So, the big question is, how did that happen? Seriously, how did a media landscape that started out as this wild, chaotic collection of fiercely independent, local voices become one of the most centralized industries on the entire planet? To get that answer, we've got to go back, way back.
All right, our first stop is the 19th century. This is really where the modern industrial-scale media machine was born. This is the moment when information stopped being just reported and started being manufactured into a product.
And this really shows you the fundamental pivot in what the media was for. The earliest papers in America, they weren't even pretending to be neutral. Nope, they were openly political tools for a specific party or cause. But then, guys like Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst came along with a totally game-changing idea. What if the goal wasn't just pushing a political agenda, but selling attention itself? And just like that, they turned the news into a spectacle of scandal, crime, and pure sensation.
And with that, they wrote a whole new playbook. By centralizing how news was gathered and spread, they built these enormous empires. What they proved was that if you could capture and hold the public's attention on a massive scale, you could generate absolutely staggering amounts of private wealth. The attention economy was officially born.
So, now you have this powerful blueprint for mass influence out there in the private world. It didn't take long for another major player to take notice. The government. This whole commercial model for grabbing attention, well, it became the foundation for the state's very own playbook.
And wow, did they learn fast. During World War I, the government spun up its first professional propaganda agency. The techniques they used were so effective, they basically gave birth to the entire field of public relations. By World War II, this thing was a sophisticated, centralized machine. And during the Cold War, it evolved again into this permanent state of narrative maintenance. Basically a never-ending effort to shape how we all think to align with national goals.
The Committee on Public Information, the CPI, was unbelievably successful. It took a public that was really hesitant about getting into World War I, and through this incredibly well-orchestrated campaign, it basically manufactured consent. They used powerful posters, films, speeches, everything in their toolkit to demonize the enemy, to define what a true patriot was, and to force total social unity around the war. It was honestly a masterclass in engineering public opinion. Okay, so let's recap. We've got a commercial model for selling our attention, and we have a government-level playbook for manufacturing consent. Now we arrive at the critical moment in the late 20th century. This is where the consolidation, the great grab, goes into absolute overdrive.
It was all set off by a single piece of legislation, the Telecommunications Act of 1996. By basically ripping up the old rules on who could own what, it fired the starting gun for a corporate land grab like we'd never seen before. The floodgates were officially open.
And the results? They are just staggering. In 1983, you had about 50 different companies controlling most of American media. And that's already pretty concentrated, right? But just look at what happened after 1996. By 2011, that number had completely collapsed, from 50 down to just 6.
So let's be really clear about what this was. This wasn't about creating more choices for you and me, or a more efficient market. No, this was a small handful of massive conglomerates carrying out a total, centralized capture of the entire information landscape.
Okay, so we've walked through the history. But what does it actually mean for us today? What are the real consequences of living inside this incredibly consolidated, engineered reality? Well, one of the biggest consequences is something called the gridlock default. You see it everywhere. Really complex issues that need careful, nuanced discussion get flattened into these simple binary fights, us versus them, good versus evil. Take immigration. A real debate requires talking about visas, economic needs, humanitarian logistics, but instead it gets framed as a moral battle, completely preventing any practical solutions. This strategy is fantastic for keeping us glued to our screens, but it makes finding real answers almost impossible.
Because, at the end of the day, the number one goal is no longer creating a well-informed public.
In this system, the gatekeepers, those 6 companies, they have to prioritize shareholder value. And that means profit. And making sure everything aligns with a core narrative comes way before a rich diversity of viewpoints or, challenging conversations.
Now, I know this all sounds pretty bleak, but here's the thing. Understanding the architecture of the problem is always the first step toward actually dismantling it. So how can we even begin to reclaim the narrative and build a more decentralized, healthier information ecosystem?
First, we have to realize that our individual choices aren't enough. Look, you can't just change the channel when most of the channels are owned by the very same parent company, all pushing the same core ideas. To make a real difference, we have to go after the systemic machinery of control itself.
So what does that actually look like? Well, it seems to break down into 3 big moves. First, it means actually using our existing antitrust laws to break up these media giants, just like we did with the big industrial monopolies a century ago. That's how you restore competition. Next, it means demanding radical transparency. We need rules that force these companies to tell us exactly who is funding them and how their algorithms are deciding what we get to see. And finally, it means we have to actively invest in and empower the alternatives. Things like independent, nonprofit, and local news outlets that are actually accountable to their communities, not to some distant shareholders.
Ultimately, this whole journey brings us right back to one fundamental, and I think, massive question. We know that information isn't just data. It is the power to shape our reality, to define what's possible, and to steer our future. So the question we're all left with is this: who should be allowed to wield that kind of power?